So, hello, everyone. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you to this talk by Mark Clifford on the topic of the book, Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World, What China's Crackdown Reveals About Its Plans to End Freedom Everywhere. I'm happy to say that today a number of people will be joining us online, and there will be a recording that will be made available for people who would like to access it later. I am David Law. I teach here at the University of Virginia Law School. I am also an honorary professor of law at the University of Hong Kong, where I served previously as the YK Chair in Public Law for a period of 5 years. So Hong Kong is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mark Clifford, who is president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong, the former executive director of the Asia Business Council, and a former board member at Next Digital. For anyone who's been following the news in Hong Kong or recent events, that is something approaching an illegal organization at this point. They had the audacity to publish Hong Kong's most popular newspaper, which took a pro-democracy stance. He is editorial chair of the Asian Review of Books and served as editor-in-chief of both the English language papers in Hong Kong, both of which had their glory days, which coincided when you were there, the Standard and the South China Morning Post. He's an honors graduate of UC Berkeley, a Walter Bagehot Fellow at Columbia University, and has a PhD in Hong Kong history from the University of Hong Kong. His book, Today Hong Kong, Tomorrow the World, is available from St. Martin's Press. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Clifford to speak to us about, to bring us up to date on the many things that unfortunately have happened even since this book came out last year.
Great. First of all, thank you so much, David. Thanks, Shirley and Brian and everyone else who made my visit here possible. So I'm really honored and delighted to be on this important August campus. So I'm going to talk for about a half an hour or so. I think we have a little more than an hour until the session ends. So there will be plenty of time for Q&A. I'm okay here if that's okay.
I'll move over to
I
don't want to be.
Does it sound okay here though?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about Hong Kong and about the work we do. In fact, we've now set up a 501c3, David. So I'm now head of the Committee for Freedom in the Hong Kong Foundation. You read the book correctly, but we set up a tax-exempt organization for our work. So the backdrop for this is China and deteriorating relations between China and the United States, and in fact, I would say between free countries everywhere in the world. And bigger picture, I think, particularly in the wake of Ukraine, I'll try to draw a little connective tissue with. I think there's a fight between autocracy and freedom for democracies, and I think that the invasion of Ukraine and Xi Jinping's threatened takeover of Taiwan are kind of part of the same threat that we face globally. And I think that Hong Kong is an important part of that puzzle. I think, kind of to jump ahead a little bit to the conclusion, perhaps, I think that Xi Jinping would like the world to believe that Hong Kong is done, dusted, solved, resistance is futile, and next up Taiwan, and after that, who knows? I think, and the work that we're doing at the committee is designed to spotlight the continuing repression in Hong Kong, the fact that there are more than 1,400 political prisoners in a city that is still trying to portray itself as an open, as a global financial center that's ruled by law, where people who come can get a fair shake. And the experience of my colleagues at Apple Daily, 7 of whom are now in jail, suggests otherwise. And so hate to have it, that's the spoiler alert, but that's where I'm going. But I think it's very important to remember that there are still 7 million people in Hong Kong, a little more than 7 million. A few 100,000 have left, largely as a result of the political situation. But of course, most people have stayed. And most of those people, I believe, still would support an open, liberal Hong Kong and would support moves towards full democracy, which is what China promised Hong Kong and Hong Kong's people when it took over after 156 years of British colonial rule in 1997. 6 out of 10 Hong Kong people have always voted for the pro-democracy, the pan-democratic camp, as it's called, They did that from the first open legislative council, city council election in 1991 until the last free, fair, open election in 2019. And I have to believe that 6 of 10 Hong Kong people at least still would like an open, free society. And so we're not, you know, our opposition to Hong Kong is to the government and to the Chinese Communist Party. It's most definitely not to the Hong Kong people. And in fact, we do what we can to support them. So I start with the backdrop that adversarial Sino-US relations or adversarial relations between China and the free world are just a feature of the geopolitical landscape we live in. We could talk separately, and we've got a lot of expert people in this room as to why this happened, whether or not it's inevitable. In a way, that doesn't matter. We face a country that wants to rewrite the rules-based international order in its image. That's a fundamentally illiberal image. It doesn't want freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. And when my book first came out, I got a little bit of pushback about, what do you mean about its plans to end freedom everywhere? So we talk more about that, but I think we can see, and the activists that I know and work with, not only Hong Kongers, but British citizens and others have been threatened, harassed, bullied by the Chinese, even in the UK, the US, and you know, many other places around the world. So this isn't just about Hong Kong or even about Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think that we need to forge a coherent national response to an adversary that threatens the future of the liberal international order. Again, I'm very focused on Hong Kong, but I want you to keep in mind the, you know, the bigger picture here. So we tried engagement with China. It was the right policy, but it didn't work. And I think we're seeing increasing threats by China to take Taiwan by force, which would, you know, potentially make the Ukraine conflict look like like an appetizer, like a very small deal. So I think we need to try to prevent more. And I think the best way to do it is to have a robust response, robust pushback to China. And I think one place we can do that is in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is kind of the Berlin of our times in terms of an outpost of, you know, diminishing, but it's an imperfect analogy, of course, because China has a lot more control over Hong Kong than Soviet Union did over Berlin. But I mean, Hong Kong does have a special role, I think, and it's a special. It matters to Xi Jinping that he brings Hong Kong under control, and it matters to the rest of us that we help Hong Kong and the 7 million people there maintain their freedoms, that we keep supporting and keep a focus on the political prisoners there. So let me talk a bit about the situation in Hong Kong, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, and then I'll talk about my relationship and the work that we've been doing for.
I need to click in with this. Yeah, on the right screen. There you go.
This is a guy named Jimmy Lai who started Apple Daily and was a billionaire until the Chinese started seizing his assets. He's been in jail, I think as of today, 835 days. He's 75 years old. He's a Roman Catholic. He's diabetic. He's a man of peace and nonviolence. And he just doing the same thing in 2020 when he was taken off to jail as he'd been doing for the previous 30 years in terms of journalism. So I will come back to that and talk about that and my experiences as he and others were on the newspaper were arrested. After I kind of give you the big picture of Hong Kong and what the Committee for Freedom does. So I think many of you will know, I know there are a lot of expert people in this room, that Hong Kong was promised 50 years of autonomy after the Chinese takeover in 1997. Hong Kong was promised that its and this is a phrase, its way of life could continue unhindered. So again, I think many of you know Hong Kong has its own currency, its own tax system, its own administrative system, and importantly, its own legal and judicial system that's based on the British common law, very, very different than the civil code that exists in the Chinese Communist Party in China, in Communist China. And of course, the application of that historically was very different. In China, the government always wins, and in Hong Kong, government often lost. Except now they have a 100% conviction rate, as they proudly told us this week in national security law cases. So anyway, I guess I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but yes, Hong Kong was promised that 50 years of autonomy. it was also promised not only continued civil and political freedom, but an expansion of those freedoms. The Basic Law, which is the mini constitution that governs Hong Kong, provided for full universal suffrage for the election of the mayor, who's called the chief executive, and the election of the city council, the legislative council. And there were indirect elections for the chief executive and kind of partially universal suffrage oriented elections for the city council. But the whole promise, the whole thrust of China's policy in the run up to 1997 is you will be even freer. You've suffered for 156 years under British colonialism. It's all going to be different after 1997. Hong Kong people are going to be masters in their own house. Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong was the slogan. Well, it didn't really work out like that because it turned out that China was, fighting in favor of free elections as long as it knew who could win, as long as its candidates would win. And unfortunately or inconveniently for Beijing, the Hong Kong people pushed back, and the kind of spirit of resistance of political involvement, but of political resistance which had developed and was, kind of still pretty embryonic during the British period, but didn't exist. That developed and blossomed. And in 2003, so just 6 years after the handover, exactly 6 years to the day, 500,000 people came out in the street to protest a national security law. This was, and the chief executive's office had told the Beijing authorities they expected about 25,000 people out in the streets. So, you see this pattern of the Hong Kong government being completely out of touch, lying to itself, lying to the Chinese, and then being, completely shocked that, 500,000 people, nearly 10% of the population came out on a sweltering day. It was close to 100 degrees, very humid. That led the government to back off on this national security legislation. But it didn't lead the government to actually listen to people and to carry out its promises of universal suffrage. And so another decade went by and there was no progress. And in fact, China was clearly rolling back its promises and was told the Hong Kong people in the summer of 2014 that there really was not going to be a move towards universal suffrage. Basically, people had enough. And over a 79-day period, millions of people went out in the streets and, most importantly, blocked the whole central part of the city and some other key areas as well. Yeah, for 79 days. So it's kind of, it started with an Occupy Wall Street kind of mentality, but it was going to be very polite and they were going to sort of go home at night and things. And the students, a whole new generation of people who've been born around the time of the handover, people who weren't, contaminated by British colonialism, which is what the Chinese blamed a lot of Hong Kong's problems on, really a whole new group of much more activist, militant people came to the fore. Again, no result. There was one conversation between the protesters and the government. It led absolutely nowhere. So kind of things ground to a halt again. Then in 2019, the government tried to put new legislation in, which would basically erase the legal distinction between Hong Kong and the mainland, and made it possible for extradition to take place from Hong Kong to the mainland, vice versa, I guess, as well. But and so that spooked not just activists but also the business community, because let's say I was a businessman and I got in a dispute with my partner in Guangdong. He could potentially, this was the fear, use his political connections to get me extradited from Hong Kong and face justice such as it is in the mainland. And that just united the business community and activists in opposition. And over an extraordinary period from June 9th until late November, millions of people came out in the streets. There were protests of up to 2 million people, repeated protests of over 1 million people. As I said, a couple of protests of 2 million or more people. Think of this, in a city of 7.5 million people. And unlike the US, where if there's a big march in DC, people from Virginia or Massachusetts or whatever might come. Nobody was coming from the mainland to take part in a protest in Hong Kong. A handful did, and they were arrested in the mainland. So you think of 2 million people who actually took the trouble to go out in the streets out of a population of 7.5 million. Still, the government not only didn't move, wouldn't negotiate, and unfortunately, things got. I'll have some pictures of this. Got more and more violent on both sides. Police were extremely heavy-handed. Protesters used a lot of kind of crude attack. Everything's from bow and arrow to bricks, and a couple of people were killed. Although the actual violence, not to minimize people who died, but it was actually relatively small given how crazy the street fighting was. And at the end of it, there was an election. And actually, as imperfect as democracies are, elections do serve a fantastic purpose, which is they allow somebody to get into power or somebody else has to lose power. And, it's a way of shaking things up and, moving decisions along. And in this case, the authorities thought there was going to be a so-called blue wave, a silent majority of conservatives who were just going to sweep all the Beijing candidates into power. And these were for the lowest level. They were for district council members, very, very low level positions, but still they were important, and they were important for gauging sentiment. The opposition, the Pan Democrats, dominated the election, swept the conservatives out of power. And I think I don't know, historians will eventually figure out maybe better what happened. But my hypothesis is that when Beijing lost the election, and it's so much thought it was going to win that we're told that the communist newspapers, Wen Weibo and Da Gongbao and others, had articles all written ready to proclaim the victory of the blue camp, of the conservatives, the pro-Beijing people. And of course, they had to tear those off. And again, I think it's an example of how out of touch the authorities were with what people in Hong Kong actually felt. So I think this is when Beijing decided, we can't, we're trying to beat these people into submission. We're trying to win at the ballot box. We can't. We lost the people of Hong Kong. And I think they should be asking some hard questions in Beijing, like, how did you lose the people of Hong Kong? Because as recently as 2008, when the Beijing Olympics were held, and actually Shirley knows, she talk a lot more about this. I mean, the pro-Chinese, the sentiment among people in Hong Kong of feeling themselves as being Chinese as opposed to Hong Kong, or as in the case of Taiwan, Taiwanese, was at an all-time high. And somehow Beijing under Xi Jinping just threw away this advantage. And increasingly there were moves in 2019 towards independence, much greater autonomy, if not outright independence. The independence movement was completely created in the last 10 years, thanks to some very short-sighted officials in Hong Kong. So we move into 2020. So 2019, this election, COVID very conveniently comes along. You say, sorry, you can't have more than 4 people together. They went from, in October of 2019, you can't wear masks anymore. And then of course, COVID comes, you have to wear masks. And by the way, you can't have more than 4 people get together. So hard to have a rally with 2 million people when you can be arrested if more than 4 of you on sanitary, health grounds, if more than 4 of you get together. So COVID very conveniently allowed authorities to undercut and not give permission to any more protests. So in May 2020, the authorities, I think, shocked even the Hong Kong elite and announced, the Beijing authorities, that they would impose a national security law. And nobody knew what that meant. Even when it came out, it came into effect the very last hour of June 30th, 2020. Even the chief executive wasn't able to see a draft of it until earlier that day. It's completely flouted. So China's had already broken all its promises about, we're going to move towards more democracy, we're going to move to universal suffrage. But under the basic law, Hong Kong also had the right to enact its own laws. As I said, the chief executive hadn't even seen the law. It was promulgated in Beijing, imposed on Hong Kong. And it was a very, very sweeping, vague national security law. I mean, of course, every country has national security laws. We do, everywhere it does. You need to protect national security. Question is how that's actually implemented and enforced. And in the case of Hong Kong, there were almost immediate roundups of people, but the most dramatic was funnily enough, on January 6, 2021. So a couple hours before, we were having some very exciting events at our capital here in the United States. Authorities were knocking on doors, 75 doors in Hong Kong, and pulling people in. They've held most of them for 2 years without bail, and they're people that, you know, would be right at home in this room. They would be people that would be regarded as leaders in any normal open society, people you want like involved in politics. I know of some of them. They were journalists, they were legislators, they were activists, they were normal citizens, professors, people from HKU, and they've been in jail pretty much for 2 years. 47 of them are on trial right now, despite the fact most have pled guilty. The trial goes on. And they are 47 of, as I said, over 1,400 political prisoners. What I'm going to summarize a little bit more, some of what's happened. Then I think I'll show these slides and then come back perhaps to talk about what the committee does. So we've had the destruction of civil society. Apple Daily, the newspaper I was involved with, was shut down. It was, as David said, you know, massive pro-democracy newspaper. We had 600,000 digital subscribers. We sold 1 million copies of our last edition. I mean, it was a monster paper. I was not involved on a day-to-day basis, but, you know, I just have really high regard for the team. You know, many of these people have been held without bail for 2 years. My colleagues, besides Jimmy Lai, with his, you know, in jail for 835 days. The other members of the Apple Daily 7 have been held since June and July of 2 years ago. National security law doesn't allow jury trial, again, completely in violation of the basic law and China's promises, has handpicked judges. It essentially criminalizes dissent. So let me go to these slides and talk a little bit, because I think that, you know, I've kind of talked very generically, but let me show you what this really looked like in person. So yeah, that was Jimmy Lai in August 2020. That was the day that they first raided our newspaper. They sent 250 police in. There they are coming into our newspaper, and treated the place like a crime scene. Did a perp walk for Jimmy. All credit to the journalists. They were live streaming it despite the police's attempts to shut that down. They were interviewing Jimmy as he was being handcuffed and perp walked through the newsroom. So this is just going to go back a little bit in history. So this is the handover. This is the end of the British rule, and the British Union Jack will be lowered on the right. The Chinese flag obviously raised on the left. This is what it looked like. I was there. I know some of the other people in this room might have been there as the PLA troops came in that night. Felt pretty scary. So some people would say, hey, you knew this is what you were getting. You were lucky to get 20 years of freedom before they threw you all in jail. So this was the last governor. This is Chris Patton playing ping pong. So his demeanor and this British openness versus this total militarization of that China brought in is just, I think, very jarring. This is just a typical Hong Kong rally, right? This was 2003. In fact, this is when 500,000 people came out and demonstrated against the national security law. So you can see one of Hong Kong's iconic trams is there. And it's very, very peaceful. I don't know how close they can see the crowd, but they're people a couple months old to 90 years old, and it was a very open, friendly, family friendly, not a window broken, no vandalism. You know, just ordinary citizens saying, hey, you know, don't treat us, you know, like criminals. Let us have the right to vote. Let us have the right to participate in our society. This is a young guy named Joshua Wong who, at the age of 15, became a new student leader, and in fact started that Occupy movement, the umbrella movement of 2014. This might have been a year or two earlier when he was protesting against the planned introduction of communist propaganda in Hong Kong textbooks. And so I want to show this because the people, you know, we had these kind of warhorse democracy people, Jimmy Lai, but people like Martin Lee, Margaret Ong, many others who were in their, you know, who were 50 years or, you know, it could have been Joshua's grandparents, you know, and I think Joshua and the others felt like, you guys have been trying for decades. What do you have? You've got nothing. You know, we're going to the streets. Enough of this, you know, politeness. And this was the beginning of the 2014 protest. Yeah, again, you just see a very youthful, I think there's that Chinese U, which many of you might be familiar with. this was, ended up being called the Umbrella Movement. This was one of the iconic photos from it. So you think of the difference between this and that photo from 2003 of the trams with all the families. So it pretty quickly changed from, just kind of mass protests to, much more confrontational street actions. Again, some of the students. This is Margaret Ong, a lawyer, barrister. Again, a longtime pro-democracy activist. I think this is interesting for one reason. So this is people raising money. I mean, the amount of money that was raised at these things was incredible. And these red bills are 100 Hong Kong dollars, so about $12.70, almost 13 US dollars. The thing is stuffed, full with them, and there were probably hundreds of boxes like this all over. So there's all this talk about foreign money and foreign collusion, and I think anybody looking at these pictures has to think that the Chinese government is deluding itself if it thinks there isn't mass support for the democracy movement. This is Martin Lee, father of Hong Kong democracy. About 80 years old, was sentenced, but was not actually sent to prison, but was found guilty on some civil disobedience charges. This now we're up to 2019. And again, you see very peaceful crowds trying to let the buses through. This is an area about 2 miles east of Central Business District. This is right outside the Central Business District. You see the skyscrapers in the background. This is an underpass, and all these are so-called Lenin walls, where people take Post-its and just write messages of support or their hopes for democracy, their hopes for Hong Kong. Chinese government really did not like this. This is ink that was splattered on the Chinese official seal at the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office on the night of, I think, July 21st, 2019. And I should say these kinds of assaults on the symbols of Chinese sovereignty really got under Beijing's skin. A Chinese flag being torn down, Chinese national anthem being booed at soccer matches, all these things became criminalized, and the Chinese government took them very, very seriously. This is a shopping mall. This is just like a lunchtime protest in 2019. So you see Coach and Bali and all these big brands. These were some nurses, healthcare workers striking, and that's another thing that actually hasn't been commented on enough is the support of labor and some nascent general strikes that were taking place. And again, I think that the government, particularly in Beijing, was very allergic to the idea that consumers would. There's Joshua. Okay, so now we're getting to the end. This is Joshua Wong, obviously in custody, and there's that picture of Jimmy Lai again. So I want to show you those slides. Why don't I spend about 5 or 10 minutes just talking about what we do at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. So we want to hold China accountable for its broken promises. Its broken promises on regard to the basic law, the mini constitution that I mentioned before, but also for the Sino-British Joint Declaration, where Britain agreed to give Hong Kong back to China, and for its violations of international treaties. So we do this through three different forms, through working with governments, media research form, and I guess civil society activism. So we have offices in both London and Washington, and we spend a lot of time engaging to some degree with administrations, but more with elected officials. We just find we can talk more about this, we just find elected officials are more responsive. We've just been involved in the UK with the first ever Hong Kong summit. We took 100+ Hong Kongers, members of the Hong Kong diaspora, into Parliament, meeting with MPs, members of the House of Lords. In DC, we've got increasingly strong relations with people who do China-related work, notably the new Special Select Committee on China, headed by Congressman Mike Gallagher. So we try to keep Hong Kong in the spotlight. We testify, we engage informally with Parliament and Congress. We've been involved in a number of hearings, as well as members of the UK and US government, including the Foreign Office, State Department, Treasury, NSC. One of our board members of the original CFHK, the C4, is Perry Link, Professor Perry Link, who's a longtime human rights activist involved with China. he has led a group of more than a dozen academics who have nominated 5 Hong Kongers for the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't think we're under any illusions that's going to happen anytime soon, if ever. Perry was involved with the successful campaign to get a Peace Prize for Liu Xiaobo. I think we should say successful in quotes, because Liu Xiaobo, of course, died in Chinese custody. So it's a kind of a Pyrrhic victory. We and other activists have worked to extend delayed enforced departure to allow Hong Kongers in the US to remain. The Biden administration extended that by 2 years in February. One of our staff members was actually the first Hong Kong activist to get political asylum in Hong Kong. So, we're involved with kind of grassroots issues to some extent, but we're more involved at a congressional and a kind of macro level. We are both Chinese and foreigners, but we have non-Chinese, I guess. But probably mostly non-Chinese. Our chair is former U.S. diplomat James Cunningham, who was ambassador various places and had been consul general in Hong Kong. We focus a lot on political prisoners. If there's time during the Q&A, I could show some videos we've done. We do large-scale wall projections, calling out the Chinese government for its violations of human rights, particularly in Hong Kong. We've done them everywhere from the Guggenheim Museum to the Tower of London Bridge. And they're pretty dramatic. Our last one, we used drone to have kind of New York skyline, and we had women political prisoners. This was for International Women's Day. That's kind of the first leg. The first leg is the legislative engagement. The second is media and research. So a lot of us have a media background. Obviously, was involved with that newspaper, with the newspapers David mentioned, and I'm particularly keen to get coverage. So a lot of us are on media, but we also and write articles, but we also fund research. So we've looked at the influence of Confucius Institutes in the UK and the pernicious influence of the United Front of the Chinese Communist Party in the UK. We recently helped fund, completely independent, but we funded research by the Atlantic Council on Hong Kong's role as a global financial center. I think we'll be funding more independent research. I mean, we're not controlling this, but we just think, we need to keep the spotlight. We need to keep attention on Hong Kong. And the final thing would be kind of more like street action. I mentioned those videos. We've been involved with efforts to call out the Hong Kong economic and trade offices, which are these quasi-consulates. Hong Kong has 3 kind of extra diplomatic missions for China, but in Washington, New York, and San Francisco, they're economic and trade offices where the officials use the diplomatic pouch, have diplomatic immunity, so they don't pay their parking tickets. They're diplomats in all but name. This was a favor given to Hong Kong to try to underscore its high degree of autonomy. And as the name suggests, economic and trade offices, the idea was they'd focus on economic and trade. In fact, they've turned more and more into kind of wolf warriors and extensions of the Chinese party. So I think that's kind of like what our strategies. I'll just finish by talking about what our theory of change is. I mean, you might have inferred I don't have Xi Jinping's private phone number. We're not in a lot of close contact with Beijing. And in fact, that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is be obnoxious. We're kind of like a pebble in the shoe. We hope that we can cause enough discomfort, not pain. We don't have a military. We're obviously nonviolent. We just cause enough trouble for China that at some point Xi Jinping is going to say, this isn't worth it. I'm taking the shoe off. I'm throwing the pebble out. Letting 1,400 political prisoners out would be a nice way for China to show that Hong Kong is back. It's open for business. It is a global financial center. So we're kind of up against this narrative where Hong Kong officials are fanning out around the world to try to convince everybody it's all business as normal. Yeah, we had a few problems a few years ago, and then we were shut down for COVID, but come on back, all is forgiven. We love you. We want foreign business back. And we're trying to say, no, it's not. This is not a normal city. This is not a global financial center. Your assets are not safe here. We talk more about, what happened with the seizure of assets at Next Digital, but, we want people to, Western business in particular, to recalibrate what the risks are of doing business in Hong Kong. So, that's kind of where we are right now, and I'm happy to talk about anything, whether it's my book or the work that we do at the committee, or just, anybody's thoughts or questions or comments on Hong Kong or China? I'll stop there. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like it if you could talk about the seizure of assets at Next Digital. And then I have a second question, which is you were talking about the work that your committee does in the United Kingdom and the United States. Do you have any interaction with elected officials in Europe or the European Union? And I'm especially curious about that because of the recent visit by Macron to China and then the Politico interview.
Let me answer that one first because it's quicker. Yeah, we just made an initial visit to Berlin. Our chairman and the head of our London office, who I should say worked very closely. He was Bill Browder's first hire. They ended up coming up with the Magnitsky Act to, punish human rights abusers individually, and that was a result. That's named after Sergei Magnitsky, who was Bill Browder's lawyer, who was killed in a Russian prison. So we have very activist kind of living in the form of my London colleague, Mark Saba. So we have engaged with, it's really a matter of bandwidth. So we just set the C3 up last September. The C4 was set up exactly 2 years ago. So we wanted to start with the UK for historic reasons because of the colonial relationship. Washington, because I think it is more important, but Berlin, I think, is actually the lynch. We've also done some visits to other smaller countries, but I think Berlin is the linchpin, and obviously the EU. The EU is hard to move, so I think we will definitely be increasing our activities in Germany and in Brussels, but still kind of early stages. Seizure of assets, I'll try to be quick, but we got a letter from the guy who's now the mayor of Hong Kong, the chief executive, John Lee, who was then secretary for security. He just wrote us a letter, dear board members, I think blah, 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 under the national security law, this, that, these powers, I think you've broken the law, freezing your bank accounts. That's all. No judge, no oversight, nobody else, just John Lee's say so. That's almost 2 years. The case has never been adjudicated in court. He's never taken the company. He's just decided that, it's going to freeze our bank accounts. We tried so many workarounds. I mean, there's so many nights of calls. We had almost 1,000 employees. We couldn't pay them. We asked for an exemption. We said, we want to pay John Smith ID number X. We want to say Jane Doe, blah blah blah. No, can't do it. Then they come after us. They sued us because you didn't pay your employees. I'm subject to 4 different, I don't know where they stand, and I'm not legally allowed to say anyway, but I'm the subject of at least 4 different investigations as a director. They want to say, we wrecked the company. So we wrecked the company. You froze the bank accounts. You told us, so we had 600,000 digital subscribers. Credit card companies like, whoa, we're not processing any payments for you because your bank accounts are frozen. Anybody who touched, we had money in a lot of other accounts. They said, if you touch those accounts to pay these people to get around, then those accounts are contaminated, was what the lawyers said. So then those accounts will be frozen. I mean, it goes on and on. We had 2 directors of these subsidiary companies. They were both in jail. They decided maybe they didn't want to be with the company anymore, so they resigned. Understood. I ended up as head of the nominating committee. Nobody wanted to get anywhere near us in Asia, including in Taiwan, by the way. Jimmy Lai had all these good friends. Everybody believed in democracy. Nobody wanted to take the risk. So I ended up getting 2 old, really old people I'd known 40, 50 years. They said, just be a director for these subsidiary companies. We needed them to actually, the government was seizing our assets. Our 2 headquarters, I mean, tens of millions of dollars of assets. We said, fine, just take them, please just leave us alone. But we needed directors to be able to give instructions to the lawyers to be able to give the property back that the government was demanding. And so they were getting more and more insistent that we give the property back. And we're like, we got to find some directors. So I found these 2 directors. I'm like, look, just sign a few papers. Don't worry. It's all going to be over in a couple of weeks. We're going to wind up the company. And then they were very nice. They're my friend. They're still my friends. I don't know why. Anyway, they were fined $1 million Hong Kong dollars each because somehow the government didn't like what they were doing, and all their personal details were leaked to the communist press. It just goes on and on and on. I mean, these are people living in America that were just trying to help with some corporate governance issues. We ended up resigning. We weren't able to. There were legal reasons as a board. We didn't have the power to liquidate the company, and so we were, again, accused of being derelict in our duty. And so Jimmy Lai has lost, I don't know how many tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. He had a company that had a market cap of just shy of $100 million. He had lent the company another, this US dollars, had lent the company another $50 million. It was just, the company's been destroyed, right? First, they seized his shareholdings, then they destroyed the company. So that's all, he's like about $150 million. And I mean, there are other, things that he suffered, and obviously he's in jail, but that's kind of, it's very interesting. And so if you're a company, you say, wait a second, I thought this place had rule of law. If they can just write a letter and then it's game over, I think it's not really what it appears. Now, Jimmy is one example, but if once they've done it to one, they'll do it to somebody else. Sorry, Dave.
We should get a sense of how many other questions there are.
Yeah, sorry.
Before we proceed. I've got a question up here. Anyone else have questions? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes left for 3 or 4 sets of questions.
We have until 4:50 or 4:30.
4:30.
Okay, so we've got a half an hour.
Okay, all right. So we're going to go to 4:30.
But if we start getting short, I'll just take all the questions at once.
Okay, all right, 4:30. Yeah,
you were next, I think, right?
Okay. Why do you think the Chinese government is not particularly worried about spoiling the image of Hong Kong? That at one time they seemed to be quite keen as a kind of showcase for certain aspects of the bright side of Chinese society. And is it related in some way to the policy of flooding Hong Kong with mainland Chinese immigrants and workers to turn Hong Kong into just another Chinese city? I mean, have they given up on that sense of Hong Kong being something special that they might want to preserve for all kinds of purposes? If it's discouraging investment, all that kind of thing, it's it's counterproductive. And
well, I mean, I would say it's counterproductive. It's somewhat schizophrenic policy because they actually do still want foreign investors to come. So Christopher Hoy, who's Secretary for Financial Services and Treasury, is in Brussels and London this week and next week. A number of other officials have gone out to kind of tout how great Hong Kong is. They have a new policy called Hello Hong Kong. They've given away air tickets, and they're trying to get outsiders to come in. At the same time, they are absolutely flooding the city with mainlanders. And I think there's a talent visa scheme, and 95% of the people accepted are mainlanders. So I kind of think there are two things going on at once. There is this kind of, it's almost an atavistic thing of we're Asia's global city, Asia's world city. And there's that kind of line, and then there's this other line that's just much more internal. And above all, it's, people reflect what their boss wants, and the boss up in Beijing clearly wants control. And so, there is this side of them that would like it to be an open international city, but if push comes to shove or there's a choice, they'll just go for the control. And it's like, okay, so what? So Goldman Sachs and everybody else leaves, so we're sanctioned. That's life.
I just wanted to add to that question, if I may. I think Hong Kong's financial center was already very Chinese before the protests. So 85% of the listings, even more for bond issuance. So in a way, to me, what they wanted to preserve was something that was much more akin to the mainland already than we think it was. So it was what I think the Chinese Communist Party needs to do to preserve Hong Kong is to preserve what was there before 2019, and that's something which was overseas Chinese money financing subsidiaries of Chinese companies in Hong Kong. And that can happen, notwithstanding everything we've seen then. And I think that's the key issue, that it had already been transformed into basically an offshore center for the mainland rather than a global financial center. And that explains a lot of what we see.
I think that's a good point. I should just very quickly say that there were basically no Chinese listings until the early 1990s, and the 94, 92 things started opening up. And then, so if you looked at the composition of the Hang Seng Index in 1992 when I arrived versus when I left in 2020, completely different, and very much to your point.
Can we just have a show of hands again as to what the remaining questions were? Richard, I think it's Professor Goldstone, and so I'm not sure. Why don't we go this order if that's all right? Richard, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you for coming today. I was just curious what your take is on business leaders and whether they're aware of what's going on, or people pulling their money out, and are elected officials in the US and the UK also with everything else that's going on, are they still focused on what's going on in Hong Kong? Is there still interest sustained?
I'll start with the end. There's a lot of interest. It's a big world though, right? I mean, there's 7.5 million people in Hong Kong and 8 billion people in the world, right? So 0.1% of the world population. I think Hong Kong does get at least its fair share of attention, but sustained, maybe sporadic would be a little more honest. I think elected officials, they're busy people, but I was meeting with a staff member of an Iowa congressman on Wednesday, and member of the Gallagher committee that I mentioned earlier, and they're very aware of China. I mean, they have stories of Chinese going to their cornfields and stealing the IP from the genetically engineered corn that keeps so there's everywhere you go. There's not everywhere you go. Almost everyone we meet understands that China is a threat. Is it an existential threat? How serious a threat? But the whole dynamic in Washington has changed in the last 10 or so years. From China, they're a bit of a problem, but we can do business with them too. They are a serious problem, and we probably better start thinking about doing less business with them. I think there's an awareness. How does that transfer into actual policy? We'll see. I mean, the Trump administration and some of the individuals, I cite a couple that I know, Matt Pottinger and Mary Kissel, I think did a terrific job along with others in kind of turning the oil tanker in terms of how American policy is oriented towards China. And I think many people have been very pleasantly surprised with the fact that the Biden administration has by and large continued that. And I would say it's been even more effective with some of the CHIPS Act about, trying to bring some manufacturing back here, but above all to start curtailing China's ability to get technology.
Yeah, Mark, congratulations on keeping the light on what's going on in Hong Kong. A couple comments and questions on political and economic leaders. Politically, my recollection is that one of the unfortunate colonial legacies is that every chief executive of Hong Kong since '97 failed. That is, every single one left office regarded as failure. I think it's because they never understood how to govern. They always thought top down, we'll figure it out, and they never got the message that that wasn't going to work. So I think that was obvious early. But the business community was always so eager to do business in China and to invest in China that they kind of kept things going. The phrase I always heard was, China's not going to do anything to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Now, I'd like you to tell me, but my sense is that the Chinese business, business community in Hong Kong has now been disabused of that notion. And that they see China as, they're willing to give up the eggs if they can cook the goose. But if that's so, are they still concerned about their investments on the mainland? Is most of the business community now intimidated and cooperating? And lastly, the point that was raised, I want to emphasize also, the people I talked to at places like EY and Deloitte, they said 10 years ago, which would have been around 2010, 90% of our business was helping foreign companies invest funds in China. By 2017, 3/4 of their business was helping Chinese firms invest their funds overseas. And that trend has only continued. And I believe China, just because they would be embarrassed if Hong Kong's economy collapsed, is pushing funds into Hong Kong for foreign investment to try and kind of keep the economy inflated. So questions, where's the Hong Kong business community's head now? And is China actively trying to keep the Chinese economy afloat in Hong Kong?
I think you're right. First of all, I should say it's very, very hard to dislodge a financial center once it's in place. And again, we should remind it what Alicia said. This is a it's a kind of offshore financial center, Chinese financial center. The business community, including, I'm sad to say, the American business community, led by the American Chamber of Commerce, and its head, former State Department official, now working at JP Morgan, has completely thrown in the towel with the government propaganda efforts. I mean, so much so that Congressman Gallagher has just written this gentleman, Jeffrey Stephen Gardner, fairly stiff series of questions. And I think that's even more true with the Hong Kong business community. I've heard that one guy I know well, I mean, even early on was saying, we're entering a new cultural revolution. I hope we can withstand it. I think most, business people everywhere like to work with governments. I mean, nobody wants to pick a fight with somebody who's got a lot of power over you. And so I think that the Hong Kongers have, I haven't been there for 2.5 years. I didn't plan to leave, but various things happen. But I have been interested to see, there's a great piece, I think it was in the Journal, it might have been in Bloomberg this week, on the loss of valuation by Hong Kong real estate companies because they're getting squeezed. So they've, there's a new sheriff in town. Well, actually he's in Beijing, but he's like policing Hong Kong. And his enforcer is a guy named Sha Bao Long, who made his career busting up Christian churches in Fujian. So I think that, business is making its accommodation. Now, some of them, people like Li Ka-shing started restructuring, so most of their assets are well out of Hong Kong. I mean, others that are more local, especially the property ones, we'll see what happens. But I think we've seen with Jack Ma from Alibaba, who was effectively under house arrest for the last couple of years and saw, we've seen hundreds of billions of dollars in valuations wiped off the tech companies, the platform companies in China. Yes, I do think China will do what it can to support the Hong Kong economy. And it will be embarrassing if the place falls apart and, all, Western firms leave, which I think is unlikely. We'll see. I mean, to Alyssa's point, to underscore what I said, if we're honest, it's very, very hard to end a global financial center. I mean, Hong Kong has nice clubs. It's, we know all these places. It's a nice place to live. But I think you have to recalibrate the risks and think of it more like a mainland place, or maybe if you're a political activist, it may be worse to be in Hong Kong because you're under kind of tighter scrutiny. So people used to worry that Hong Kong would become just another Chinese city. I would say, yeah, like Xinjiang and Tibet, like another Chinese. So yeah.
Mark, thanks very, very much. We're glad that you're here. I think I was going to ask a question about the business community, but I think it's already been raised and answered. So let me ask about another institution, set of institutions, given the fact that you're in an American example, and that's higher education. We've heard on our last visit to Hong Kong and then talking to others from Hong Kong that the number that we're given is about 1/3, 30% of university faculty have resigned, many of whom have left Hong Kong. You've already implied one solution, and that is to import to replace them mainland Chinese who probably have sterling credentials, PhDs from Western and American universities. But I'm wondering what you can tell us about the kind of the mood of the status of universities in Hong Kong going forward. Several of us, including our dear friend Prashant Kumar here, have taught in Hong Kong. So this is something that we really worry about.
I think you're much more up to date. I mean, I haven't been there for 2.5 years, but I've heard that, I know a lot of, I got my PhD at HKU and a lot of faculty have left, and very, very bad. I mean, Benny Tai was a professor there. He's in jail, right? We first saw the gutting, I think, of, a number of institutions. We saw people like Johannes Chen not getting tenure or not getting promotion, and I guess not getting tenure. I'm not sure I have exactly these details right. People going to prison. So it tends to have a chilling effect on people. And I didn't know the 30% number, but everything you're saying, and you're probably more current, jives with what I'm hearing. It's just very discouraging. And a place like HKU that's just celebrated its 100th anniversary a few years ago and was set up to kind of bring, as a colonial project, to bring enlightenment into China, is now, I think, a tatter, a shell of its former self. I just don't see how the humanities, in particular law and can really survive in an environment such as the one we have, where, again, you're probably familiar with this incident, everybody else may not be, but there was the student union at HKU supported someone who actually, I'm not getting the details right, but somebody died. The student union came out with something. Bam! They were all arrested. I mean, okay, it was probably a stupid and a juvenile kind of statement of condolence, but it was a statement of condolence for someone who died that the government had decided was politically evil. And so, I mean, that's the environment. I mean, just hear so many stories like that. But I'd love to love to hear more of yours.
There was one of the folks for the beverage company who attacked a police officer, and the Hong Kong Student Union expressed sympathy for the attacker and was forced off campus. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
The questions, I don't want to, we can talk about this later. I don't want to take up that with responding to what's happening internally within HKU. But let me exercise moderator's privilege by maybe throwing a few questions, and maybe that will let them appetite a bit further. So one question we face is clearly people who have taken the time out on a Friday afternoon to come here care about what's going on in Hong Kong. The question is, what can we do? And to some extent, what can the Committee on Freedom do, especially given the national security laws, deliberate criminalization through the law of conspiracy of anything and anyone having to do with Hong Kong. The point being to attempt to contaminate anyone in Hong Kong working for democracy with ties to an organization like this, treating everything as if it's a prosecution under RICO, the Racketeering and Corrupt Organizations Act, trying to tag you with some tie to Mark Clifford or this organization, and then perpetuating the consistent narrative of the Chinese Communist Party in every political crackdown, which is all discontent is purely a result of internal meddling. Of course, the Chinese people, including the good people of Hong Kong, love us. It's just because of the foreign contaminants like Mark Clifford and the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong. So the two parts of the first question are, what can we do? And second, what can we do without playing directly into the narrative that the problems we see in Hong Kong are the result of foreign meddling? So that's one question. The second question is, in terms of encouraging Western businesses to recalibrate, an example of something that the committee can do. Haven't they recalibrated to this point? In what American or multinational business, given the withdrawal of U.S. capital and U.S. investment that we're seeing it go off a cliff in Hong Kong, haven't they already got the memo? And is there some wall we're going to hit where the companies that remain in Hong Kong simply because it is the best possible gateway to do business in China? And so nothing you say is going to get to the factor in any more risk than we've already factored in. I have a third question having to do with time. Let's leave it there.
Okay, yeah. This is a very important point, David. I mean, so I can't have contact with anyone. I just can't. I mean, because I would be putting them at risk. And so that does limit what we can do. I mean, so for example, we showed, or we were the hosts of a new documentary that's come out in Jimmy Lai, the Hong Konger. And last night was the first, it's gonna kind of premiere globally for free next week. But we had a showing, anybody could sign up on Eventbrite last night. We had people from Hong Kong watching. They can still watch. The firewall isn't there, but I mean, I can't be in touch with somebody. I don't know. I think even if they asked us a question on a chat group, they would be putting themselves in. So that's about the most that we can do. We can't be in contact with people in Hong Kong, except in that kind of passive way. And so it's a very artfully drawn law. I mean, it goes even further. You may be aware there's a guy named Benedict Rogers who runs a group called Hong Kong Watch, started in 2017. Benedict is a British citizen based out of the UK, and Hong Kong Watch, effective group, has a website, and he got a threatening letter from the Hong Kong, I guess it was the police, saying you and your website are in violation of the national security law. Shut it down, or we could arrest you under the national security law. So Benedict, again, UK citizen working in London, has to worry if he goes to Thailand or Portugal or some of the other places that have extradition treaties with China, that he could be snatched on the basis of a Chinese warrant and extradited to China. So it's really serious. So what can we do? All we can do is basically respect this firewall and say, okay, we're gonna have to work very indirectly, and that's the kind of pebble in the shoe. We have to work through our elected representatives, governments. I mean, we can talk more granular about this, but sanctions. Do you go for sanctions? Do you have legislation? Do you have street actions? All of the above. But then how do you move the needle with Xi Jinping? It's hard. As you heard my theory of change. Do you have the sense that there is
part of this catch-22 here first. If you can't talk to anyone in Hong Kong because that will contaminate them. On the other hand, how do you know what's going on in Hong Kong if you can't talk to people in Hong Kong? So there's a catch-22. Second, is there anything that you're conveying at this point to American businesses that they kind of don't already understand? I mean, my anecdotal experience has been that if anything, and this is not to imply that things in Hong Kong are not extremely dire, but if anything, there is often an overestimation of how much things have already decayed in Hong Kong. I don't mean not to say that they're not.
Right, yeah, no, I
but you know, there was this kind of sense I was getting from my own family. You're going to be in prison if you don't come back now. I'm like, no, I'm not. But that is, if anything, the Western narrative may be in some respects not to defend what's happening in Hong Kong, but it may be.
No, I see what you're saying, because the media does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're fabricating things, just they're seizing on the most visible, spectacular things that you see. And maybe that's not representative of what's going on.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, there is still a media in Hong Kong. There still are diaspora of people who talk to people in Hong Kong. I just don't, right? So I think, but it is much harder to find. I mean, Apple, we had about 1,000 employees in all. We had about 600 in Hong Kong. So we were all over everything, right? Every court case, every corrupt guy. I mean, we don't have that information anymore. So the court cases, I mean, who's really following these cases? It's really hard.
So what sources of information do you recommend for people in this room? I mean, I think people would like to know more. That's why they're here. Are there media? I mean, there's the Hong Kong Free Press, I guess, but are there outlets you recommend? What do you recommend at this point?
There are 7, I think, diaspora media outlets. Most of them are in Chinese. I mean, there actually one just started earlier this week, based out of Taiwan. But you know, those are mostly in Chinese. So I actually think Hong Kong Free Press is pretty good. We have a newsletter. Please sign up. Send me an email directly or go on our website. You actually may prove your point. About our newsletter gets 30% open rate. So either there is not a lot of other information, or I don't know. But anyway, so it's hard, right? I mean, we don't know as much as we should. Now, as far as business goes, hard to say. I mean, you know, the financial firms are still very, very active in Hong Kong. Now, of course, they'll go there on a financial summit and they'll say, we're fully committed to Hong Kong. And then their back office people will be filtering away all the wealth management people to Singapore. And, you know, I think Singapore is kind of taking over the, you know, the kind of Monaco of China role that Hong Kong had hoped to have. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's, you know, it still is a big American presence there. I think there were 85,000 Americans. I think something like an estimated 51,000 have left, but it's still a sizable presence. So I'm not sure that it's completely fallen off the cliff.
What do you think the business community, the American business community, still needs to understand that they haven't figured out?
I think that they think that people like us, or actually more importantly, the State Department, are kind of overly focused on, you know, a few thousand people being arrested in Hong Kong, and the business community thinks that we need to look at the bigger picture. I think they're not looking at the bigger picture, which is this is now a geopolitical, perhaps even an existential struggle, and then they don't understand that they risk being in the situation that IBM or some others were in mid-1930s Germany, where Germany, you go back and read the things, it's actually kind of uncanny the way what the business community in the US and Europe, or the US and the UK said in the 1930s vis-a-vis Germany. Fastest growing economy, major economy, we have to be their biggest foreign market, can't possibly leave. And Thomas Watson getting, you know, awarded a big medal from big honor from the Nazi government. And I think that the business ends up kind of losing, you know, if there really is a war in Taiwan, I mean, Hong Kong is going to be a serious collateral damage. And so I do think, you know, Apple would probably be the company that gets the least when we're talking more generally about China. I mean, companies need to start moving to disassociate themselves from China. I'm not saying they should pull out completely necessarily, but they need to understand that if there is if there's a war, they could lose everything in China and in Hong Kong. I don't think they've recalibrated that really big geopolitical threat.
I've got a follow-up for one question. I think there may be, at this point, this may have the appetite from some people. One question, is that a question bubbling up? Do you think we hear a lot nonstop, ad nauseum, from the Chinese government on the red lines that all of you must respect, and if you cross this red line, we will fry you. Okay, so we know at this point that red line is completely amorphous, shifting all the time, aggressively moving forward. Who knows where it is? The more interesting question is the flip question. Are there any red lines at this point that you do not think the CCP would cross with respect to Hong Kong? What limits are left on the CCP, self-imposed limits? What other limits could there be? And why are those limits there? Are there any limits left on what the CCP is willing to do? Short of maintaining facilities in Hong Kong that allow corrupt party officials to print hard currency in the basement of the Bank of China, short of using Hong Kong as a money laundering operation, party elites, is there anything else that the CCP isn't willing to destroy in Hong Kong?
Could I ask an elaboration on that? What do you think is going to change in 97 when the 50 years are up? Some are still saying, well, at least 50 years, it'll be extended. Others more pessimistic say, well, first of all, when it says Chinese in law as one of the two languages, it will become Mandarin, not Cantonese. That English will be dropped. That's the same question. It's not in terms of violation of human rights. It's basically changing, as they have the right to do, changing what they mean by one country, two systems after 1997.
I told you about it. I don't even. Well, I like 1997 better because I told you a little over coffee a little while ago. I studied history and I don't predict the future. But since you I'm not sure there's anything. And by the way, this money laundering point is a very, very interesting one. It's one where we hope to do more work. And I know there's a lot of interest on the part of U.S. congressional members because Hong Kong has always been a kind of laundry, right? I mean, but in a good sense, I think. A lot of it has been a way of getting around capital controls in China that, we're seen as kind of impeding like good, legitimate businesses. There's always been money laundering, North Korea, or obviously Macau was more important perhaps than Hong Kong. We have uncovered without even really looking, increased evidence. Burma is, there's a lot of laundering for the military in Burma. There's now laundering for Iran, Russia, of course. The chief executive, John Lee, famously, when Alexei Mordashov sanctioned Russian oligarchs, mega yacht came to Hong Kong. John Lee said, no problem. We're not going to seize this. We don't respect U.S. sanctions. And of course, who knows what laundering is going through for corrupt Chinese officials. So I actually think Hong Kong is going to kind of flip. And one of the things that you talked about recalibrating risk, I think businesses, especially financial institutions, are going to have to wonder if they want to be tarred with a place that is increasingly seen as a, not a place like New York or London where money laundering is incidental, but where it's kind of central. So that'll be an interesting narrative. And you can invite me back in a year and I'll see if we've made progress on that. About red lines, I don't know that there's anything. They do want that prerogative that you talked about, David. I do think we should look at things like, will they send somebody like Jimmy Lai to a mainland jail? Will they bring mainland style detention to Hong Kong, mainland style prison treatment? Because, yes, Jimmy Lai is locked up. My understanding is that he feels freer than he's ever felt. And I think, he's in solitary confinement, but he's being treated well. That was not the case with everybody in the Soviet Gulag, maybe anybody in the Soviet Gulag, and it's certainly not the case with Chinese prisons. So, I mean, I would be watching for some of those things. I just don't know what to say about 2047. I don't know if there's going to be much of a difference then. If it's useful for them to have Hong Kong with its own, we again talk about the financial system. We haven't talked about the role of Hong Kong as a dollar clearing center. Hong Kong is a dollarized economy. It has the hardest peg of any currency in the world. You have $7.80 Hong Kong. You can change it for $1 US. And there's no other peg that's that effective that has lasted. It's almost 40 years now. So if that's useful to the Chinese, I think they'll keep it. And if it's not, they won't, right? It might still be useful for optics, but 20 years is a long time. I'd like to know where, that'll be just before the 100th anniversary, 2 years before the 100th anniversary of the PRC. So who knows?
We do have another question here, although I was going to say, isn't the dollarization of the peg, isn't that central to Hong Kong's values of money laundering?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
So there's a reason for them to keep that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your talk. I'm curious because you're an activist, but also you're also on a hand. I guess I'm right. And then you're also like background in history. I'm kind of curious how you saw the Chinese crackdown to say as on Hong Kong. Do you see it more as like an ideological driven one, or do you see it as a historical response to what it perceived? Because the threat on sovereignty, one could argue, is a relation to the century of humiliation. So that my question is short: is do you see the crackdown on Hong Kong as very purely ideological or one of a historical response? And how do you think that could inform the dialogue with?
I mean, I think it's about power, but it's wrapped in ideology. I mean, I think it's wrapped in this narrative of century of humiliation that kind of had been waning for a while. It sort of comes and goes in when it's needed. But I think it's because the CCP wants power and they will do anything to maintain power. And yes, of course, they tell themselves an ideological story, but they couldn't just as I think Taiwan is an affront. There's no reason that China needs to invade Taiwan. I mean, it could Soviet Union tried to invade Finland, it failed, but then we had Finlandization, which, they dominated Finland. And there's no reason that China, I'm sorry to say this, but, China can dominate the neighborhood. It doesn't have to take over Taiwan. So I think, again, I'd be interested to hear what some others think if we have time after this, why does China need to do that? Is this partly because Taiwan and Hong Kong were such an affront to the narrative that Chinese people aren't ready for democracy and the CCP's kind of phrasing of it? I mean, Taiwan is, vibrant, modern, open society, democratic society, and that gives the lie to Beijing's narrative that China can't have democracy. So I think that there is an ideological component, but it's also just control, control, control. And if you're somebody like Xi Jinping, you can never have enough control. I mean, why would a guy like that worry about being mocked as Winnie the Pooh? You're running a country of 1.4 billion people and you're worried about being compared to Winnie the Pooh. I mean, grow up.
That brings us to 4:30, if I'm not mistaken. I hope we can all give Dr. Clifford a warm round of applause.